grab a look. It looks like we are back up online. Sorry for the confusion, everybody. Some technical difficulties this morning. For those of you who missed it, we're back here on this beautiful Thursday and continuing to read through this wonderful book here, the Jesus Storybook Bible, a book and a little story Bible all about the fact that the Bible is not a bunch of disconnected stories about many people, but actually one connected story about one true hero, which is Jesus. We are going to see if this will work here as we move forward. We're going to pick up where we left off, which was right as God's people were saved from Egypt. God brought them out, and they were leaving Egypt when we last left. And so we are going to move on over to the book here. We are going to see if we can get things going here. So we are beginning with this next chapter, which is called God Makes a Way, Moses and the Red Sea. Moses and God's people escaped out of Egypt and into the wilderness. They didn't know the way, but God knew the way, and He would show them. I will bring you to a new home, a special land, God promised them. I will look after you. I am with you. God sent a big cloud for them to follow, a pillar of smoke stretching up to the sky. It moved in front of them as they walked and shaded them from the blazing heat of the day. And when it was time to rest, it stopped. All through the cold desert nights, it kept them warm, glowing like fire. God led His people through the desert to the edge of a great sea. They were just wondering how to cross it when suddenly they heard a terrible thundering and pounding. It sounded almost like horses' hooves. They shaded their eyes to look back and screamed. It was Pharaoh and his army were coming to get them. Pharaoh had changed his mind again. "Get my slaves back," he screeched, and charged out into the desert after them with 600 of his fastest horsemen and every single chariot in Egypt. What were God's people going to do? In front of them was a big sea. It was so big there was no way around it. But there was no way through it. It was too deep. They didn't have any boats, so they couldn't sail across, and they couldn't swim across because it was too far and they would drown. And they couldn't turn back because Pharaoh was chasing them. They could see the flashing swords now glinting in the baking sun and the dust clouds, and chariot after scary chariot surging toward them. So they did the only thing there was left to do: panic. "We're going to die," they shrieked. "Don't be afraid," Moses said. "But there's nothing we can do," they screamed. "God knows you can't do anything," Moses said. "God will do it for you. Trust Him and watch." "But there's no way out," they cried. "God will make a way," Moses said. Another minute and it would have been over. But then the strangest thing happened. Here we go. We got to turn this one around. God made the pillar of smoke move. It moved behind His people and hid them from the Egyptians. Then God sent a strong east wind to blow all night long. It blew on the water of the big sea. It blew it to the left and it blew it to the right until it blew it into two towering walls of water. And there, right through the middle of the sea, a muddy pathway opened up, and God's people walked across on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to follow, the walls of water crashed back down on them and swallowed them up. God's people were safe. They danced and laughed and sang and thanked God. When there had been no way out, God had made a way. Many years later, once again, God was going to make a way where there was no way. From the beginning, God's children had been running from Him and hiding. God knew His children could never be happy without Him, but they couldn't get back to Him by themselves. They were lost. They didn't know the way back, but God knew the way, and one day He would show them. That brings us to our next story, which is called 10 Ways to be Perfect, about Moses and the 10 Commandments. So there they all were, grannies, granddads, babies, uncles, aunts, children, moms, and dads, out there in the middle of the desert. They had blisters from all the walking. They were hungry and thirsty and much, much too hot. "We don't like it," they said. "It stinks." And so did they, for that matter, because no one had taken a bath in weeks. Now remember, because this is something they'd forgotten, God had done amazing things for His people. He'd hidden them inside a cloud. He'd moved the sea. He had set them free. But God's people still weren't happy. They didn't care about being free. Wasn't it better when they were slaves? At least they'd had lots of nice food to eat. "God doesn't want us to be happy," they said. It was the same lie that Adam and Eve had heard all those years before. "God has brought us out here to kill us. God doesn't love us." But they didn't know God very well, did they? Every day of their journey, God kept on showing His people how well He would look after them, if they would trust Him and obey Him. When they were hungry, God made the sky rain with food, bread coming down from heaven. "What is it?" they asked each other. They didn't know, so they called it, "What is it?" which of course is a very good name for something when you don't know what it is. When they were thirsty and started quarreling, God made water flow from a rock. Moses called that place Quarreling, because that seemed like a good name too. And still God's children didn't trust Him or do what He said. They thought they could do a better job of looking after themselves and making themselves happy. But God knew there was no such thing as happiness without Him. So God led them to a tall mountain. God wanted to talk to His people and show them what He was like. He wanted to help them know Him better and tell them about the special land He was going to give them. "The whole earth belongs to me," God said, "but I have chosen you. You are my special family. I want you to live in a way that shows everyone else what I am like, so that they can know me too." God called Moses up the mountain. The great mountain shook. A thick cloud fell. Thunder roared. Lightning crackled. And God gave Moses 10 rules called commandments. "I want you to love me more than anything else in all the world. And know that I love you too," God told them. "That's the most important thing of all." God gave them other rules, like don't make yourselves pretend gods, don't kill people or steal or lie. The rules showed God's people how to live and how to be close to Him and how to be happy. They showed how life worked best. "God promises to always look after you," Moses said. "Will you love Him and keep these rules?" "We can do it. Yes, we promise," they said. But they were wrong. They couldn't do it. No matter how hard they tried, they could never keep God's rules all the time. God knew they couldn't, and wanted them to know it too. Only one person could keep all the rules, and many years later God would send him to stand in their place and be perfect for them, because the rules couldn't save them. Only God could save them. This brings us to our third chapter for the day, which is called The Warrior Leader, about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. After Moses died, God gave his people a new leader. His name was Joshua, which means the Lord saves. Joshua was going to lead God's people into the special land God had promised to give them. By this time, God's people had been wandering around in that baking desert for 40 years. So you can imagine how sick they were of sand and anything yellow and tents and walking and being hot. And how happy they were to reach the edge of the desert and to see their beautiful new home right there in front of them, all cool and green and lovely. There was only one problem: Jericho. Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any old city. It was a fortress, and it stopped anyone from getting into the land. The people looked at Jericho, at the big, giant, scary walls all around it, at the tall, towering ramparts, at the heavy iron gates bolted shut, and at each other. What would they do? No one knew, but God knew, and God told Joshua what to do. But Joshua must have looked surprised, because it was a very odd battle plan indeed, as we'll soon find out. Then God made his people a promise. I will always be with you, and I will never, ever leave you. If you do what I say, your lives in the new land will be happy and everything will go well. So Joshua gathered his army together. They had their swords and spears and shields. They were ready to fight, but the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Joshua's army went marching, marching, marching around the city, day after day after day. "They are too scared to fight," the people of Jericho said. But they were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city not once, but 7 times. Then God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. Has anyone ever told you to make as much noise as you possibly can? Well, imagine that noise. Add 39,999 other people making that noise too, and you get the idea. Ear-splitting. And as it turned out, stone-splitting too, because the huge, strong walls of Jericho just crumbled to the ground as if they were made of sand. Jericho vanished in a great cloud of dust. So it was that God's people entered their new home, and they didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk. Joshua said, "God has brought you safely here. Now will you do what he says?" Everyone said, "We promise." "Only God can make your heart happy," Joshua said, "so don't pray to pretend gods." "No," they said, "never." I'm afraid they didn't keep their promise. They didn't do what God said, and many years later, just as God warned them, things would go badly for God's people. They would lose their home. Enemies would capture them and take them off as slaves, and God's people would scatter into many different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home no one could ever take from them. All right, we're going to do one more here this afternoon. This one is called The Teeny Weeny True King. Samuel anoints David. God's people had a new land. Now they wanted a king. But God is your king, Samuel told them. He is the one who looks after you best. We want a real king, they said, one we can see. God knew that a king might not be kind to his people or look after them as well as he would. But God's people didn't care. They wanted a king, and they wanted him now. So God gave them a king. He was called Saul, and he seemed like a good king at first. But he became proud and stopped listening to God. He didn't obey God or love God with his whole heart. Saul can't help me with my plan, God said. I need a king who loves me and will teach my people to love me. I need a true king. God had just the one in mind. Go to Bethlehem, God told Samuel. You'll find the new king there. Samuel's job was to listen to God and tell people what God said. So Samuel went to the little town of Bethlehem. God told Samuel to go to Jesse's house. God was going to choose one of Jesse's sons to be the new king. Now, Jesse had 7 strong sons. Now, in those days, if you were going to be the king, you didn't have to be the richest or the cleverest, although that was always nice. You had to look like a king, which meant you had to be the tallest and the strongest, so you could carry the longest swords and biggest armors and defeat everyone. And it didn't hurt to be handsome either. Samuel asked Jesse to bring him each son in turn. So Jesse brought the oldest, tallest, strongest son. This must be the new king, Samuel thought. He looks like a king. But God didn't choose him. You're thinking about what he looks like on the outside, God told Samuel, but I am looking at his heart, what he's like on the inside. So Jesse showed Samuel his next oldest, tallest, strongest son. God didn't choose him either. In fact, God didn't choose any of the 7 sons. Samuel said, "Is that all?" Jesse laughed. "Oh, well, there's the youngest one, but he's just the weakling of the family. He's only teeny." "Bring him," Samuel said. Jesse's youngest son came running up. God spoke quietly to Samuel. "This is the one." His name was David. "He has a heart like mine," God said. "It is full of love. He will help me with my secret rescue plan. And one of his children's children's children will be the king, and that king will rule the world forever." Samuel anointed David's head with oil, which was a special way to show that you were God's chosen king. "You will be the new king one day," Samuel told him. And sure enough, when he grew up, David became king. And God chose David to be king because God was getting his people ready for an even greater king who was coming. Once again, God would say, "Go to Bethlehem. You'll find the new king there." And there, one starry night in Bethlehem, in the town of David, 3 wise men would find him. For now, that brings us to the end of our day. Thank you once again for joining us. It's possible that the stream was quite a bit more choppy than usual, so hopefully, if you weren't able to catch this live because of the issues that we've been having, hopefully we'll have a smoother recording up for you to watch at a later date if you'd like to go back and watch it. As I've mentioned the last few weeks, I do have quite a number of copies of this book for anybody who would be interested in having one for their own children and for their own family reading. Do just let me know. Tune in again tomorrow afternoon for our regular Friday roundtable discussion on TableTalk. Until then, I hope that you have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you all for our Sunday service live stream on Sunday morning. Have a great day. Bye.